It was October 2022. Call me R. That's all I can give you, and I'm not sure if I should even give that much. The company I worked for would fire me if they knew I was telling you this. And to be honest, I probably shouldn't be sharing it at all. But there's no way I can just keep quiet anymore. I need to tell someone, anyone. My conductor experienced this all as well. He wouldn't admit what he saw. At one point, he even went far enough to flat out deny that anything happened, making me out to be a liar. Even though he said he never saw what I saw, he suddenly put in his notice and quit about a month later. I won't even acknowledge him in this account moving forward. He saw those things, and I think it completely broke him. I won't hold it against him. I completely understand. I hope he doesn't hear this, though. He will know who I am, and he could possibly have me fired. I will deny I wrote this if that happens. Just a heads up. I've been working as a train engineer for almost 14 years. I run freight across the country, often late at night. It's not an easy job, and it gets lonely out there, especially on those long stretches of track in the middle of nowhere. But after all these years, I've gotten used to it, in a way. I've learned to appreciate being alone, or at least I did, until that October. I was running my usual route through northern Wisconsin. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I had miles of track ahead of me. If you've never been through that part of Wisconsin, let me just paint a quick picture for you. It's nothing but forest, thick, endless woods that seem to go on forever. There are barely any towns at all in this area, and no signs of life, just me, the train, the tracks, and the trees. That night the air was cold. There was barely any natural light from the moon, and the train's headlights were the only light source as far as you could see. I settled in for a long haul. The steady rhythm of the train's wheels on the tracks always sets me into a sense of routine. I've done this 1,000 times before. Nothing ever happened out there. Not to me, anyway. But that night, something did. The route was going fine, normal, until I rounded a bend in the tracks, a well-known area for any rail worker that's been through that section of track. After the bend is where the trees come right up to the edge of the rails. It's one of those places that always gives you the creeps. No reason why, just something about it. How the trees seem to close in on you. It's not just me either. I've had other guys tell me they felt the same way about that spot. But we all usually just laugh, and at least we used to. As the train made the turn, my headlights was only lighting up the track and the trunks and branches of the surrounding trees. As soon as I hit the straight, I thought I saw something in the trees off to my right, but I wasn't positive. Sometimes your eyes can play tricks on you out there, so I paid it no mind at first. There are all kinds of wildlife out there, but it looked like something big standing near the tree line, but again, that's not unusual out there. There's all kinds of larger animals, and they also pass through that area. Although they don't usually come near the tracks, but this wasn't a deer, and it wasn't a bear. There were 3 of them. I swear I could see all 3 standing side by side. They were half hidden in the trees. They were huge, and they were standing upright like a person would, on their back legs. Their bodies were covered in hair or fur, but it was sparse in places and seemed to be thin. I could see the shine of skin through the hair. I'll never forget their heads and faces. They looked like wolves, but not normal wolves. These things were bigger, a lot bigger, with longer muzzles and glowing eyes that reflected the train's headlights. It was like their eyes were glowing in the dark, tracking the train as it moved. They were standing in a row, almost like statues. Two were close to the same size, and one, the one on the far end, was about 4 feet taller and much bigger than the other two. They were all the same dark gray color. I started rubbing my eyes. I thought I was imagining it. I must be seeing things, I told myself. It's late, I'm tired, and this creepy spot has my mind messing with me. But as I slowed the train a little just to get a better look, they didn't disappear. They stepped closer to the tracks. That's when the fear set in, because I knew what I was seeing was in fact alive and breathing. They were real creatures. The biggest one moved first. It took a step out of the trees into the edge of my lights, and for the first time I could see it in the open. This thing was huge. It had to be close to 9 feet tall, maybe bigger. And it was built like a tank. I could clearly see its muscles under its fur. I could see it had some sort of hands, but it looked like it only had 3 big long fingers, and the claws alone were as long as my fingers. But it wasn't just the size that scared me. It was the way the damn things moved. They were too smooth, too controlled. I've never seen anything move that fluid, man or beast. It wasn't afraid of the train. It wasn't afraid of me. And by the size of it, I don't think it was afraid of anything. It took another step closer, and I swear to God I saw it grin at me, or at least it looked and felt like it did. That's when things went off the rails, pun intended. The 3 of them suddenly started running and chasing the train, but they weren't just running. They were leaping across the tracks back and forth like it was some kind of sick game. One minute they were on all fours running alongside me, and the next they were up on 2 legs jumping across the rails with little to no effort. They'd jump in front of the train, then back again, darting into the darkness of the trees, only to reappear on the other side. It was like they were just trying to mess with me, taunting me, almost like a game of tag, and no matter how fast I was going, they kept up. I couldn't outrun them. Their speed was very unnatural. No living thing that size should physically be able to move like that. They didn't seem to care that a massive freight train was barreling down the tracks. It was like they wanted me to know that they could catch me if they really wanted to. I forced myself to stay focused on the controls. It's almost like something told me to slow down, to stop. But I knew that I couldn't do that. Whatever these things were, they were too fast, too strong, and stopping would give the opportunity to get closer, and even worse, get inside the train. I just kept it moving and kept my eyes locked on the tracks ahead, refusing to look back. But I could feel them there just outside the light of the headlights. And as the train pushed through that dark stretch of woods, I saw something that made things a lot worse. There were more of them. Eyes, dozens of glowing eyes scattered throughout the trees, following the train. They didn't move, they didn't run like the first 3, they were just watching, like they were an audience for the other 3. All the eyes were the same dull amber color. I didn't have time to count, but with the 3 chasing me, there had to be at least 7 or 8 of those things out there. The first 3 kept up their game of chase the terrified man in the train for what felt like miles. Back and forth they went, leaping across the tracks like it was nothing. And just when I thought I was about to lose my mind completely, they stopped. As fast as they had appeared, they just vanished back into the woods. The eyes, they were gone as well. Everything went back to normal. but I'm not so sure I even know what normal is after that. I kept the train moving, speeding up, desperate to get away from that stretch of track. When I reached the next station, I reported it to my superiors, and I told them everything about the creatures, about what I saw. They wrote up a report, but nothing ever came of it. No one talked about it. No one wanted to talk about it. They told me to forget it and keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my job. But how can someone forget something like that? I can't help but wonder, did they know these things were out there? Why don't they want me to mention it to anyone? It doesn't make sense to me. I doubt I'll ever know for sure. I still run that same route, and every time I get to that stretch of track, I can feel it. That heavy presence, like they're still out there, watching as I pass through. I try not to look anymore. I keep my eyes on the track and my hands on the controls, and I pray that I make it through without seeing them again. Luckily, I haven't seen them after that night. I don't know what they were. Do dogmen run in packs? If not, then what did I see that night? There were so many of them, and they worked together to just flat out scare me to the brink of insanity. If anyone has heard of dogmen running in large groups or packs, please let me know. Like everyone else, I have a lot of questions with no clear answers. Hopefully someone listening can provide some. Any answers would be great. I am at a loss here. Stay safe and keep in touch. R. All names have been changed for privacy purposes. My name is Jake, and I've been a wildland firefighter for around 5 years now. I've faced chaos and terror in the form of flames. And what started as a routine call quickly spiraled into the most horrifying experience of my entire life. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness is a stunning, rugged region known for its lakes, forests, and abundant wildlife. However, in the summer of 2021, it became a fiery battlefield. The fire had been sparked by lightning strikes during storms on July 14th, and it quickly spread due to severe drought conditions. By the time my crew was deployed on August 4th, the fire had already scorched thousands of acres. The situation was critical, and we were there to prevent it from getting worse. When we arrived, the air was thick with smoke, and ash was falling like snowflakes. The flames towered above the treetops. We were briefed immediately, warned about the rapidly changing conditions. The fire was unpredictable, driven by dry fuels and gusting winds that turned it into a monster. It was a perfect recipe for disaster. I was part of a crew of 20, a team of seasoned firefighters. Our mission was to create fire breaks, clearing brush and trees to stop the fire's relentless advance. The work was grueling, the heat was suffocating, but we were focused and determined. I teamed up with Tom and Chris, two firefighters I trusted with my life. Tom was an older guy in the firefighting game longer than most of us, and someone you wanted by your side in a crisis. As we moved deeper into the forest, the roar of the fire became deafening. The ground beneath us crackled and smoldered, and every step was like wading through an oven. Suddenly, the wind shifted, gusting hard from the north. The fire line where we were working to contain was now headed straight for us. I could feel the heat intensify. I shouted back at Tom and Chris that we indeed need to move now. Just as I turned to retreat, something caught my attention. I saw a dark figure moving through the smoke. At first, I thought it might be a black bear fleeing from the fire, but then I realized it was moving on two legs and it was far too tall. The figure emerged from the smoke, only about 10 feet away from me. My heart stopped, and what little breathing I was able to do had now stopped completely. This creature was massive, towering over 7 feet tall. Its fur was matted and ashy, but patches were burnt off, revealing blistered, scorched skin underneath. It was still smoking, and the smell of burnt hair and flesh thick in the air, making my stomach turn completely upside down. It looked like a monster straight out of a nightmare. Its long arms ending in massive human-like hands. It had bright yellow eyes, and they were locked onto mine. The creature growled, and its mouth opened to reveal a mouthful of teeth. The sound of its heavy, ragged breathing, in it, I could hear a mix of pain and rage. It was almost like it was blaming us for the hell that had been unleashed on its home. For that moment, I couldn't move. The sight of this beast of pure muscle and rage, burned and blistered, was unlike anything I could have ever believed to be real. I heard Tom yell at me that I needed to get out of there. His voice snapped me out of my stupor. The thing took a step closer, and the low growl in its throat sounded deeper. I knew then that if I stayed any longer, this thing would most likely kill me. I heard Chris yelling as well, saying we gotta move as he was backing away. Neither of them had seen it. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my legs burning as I fought my way through the smoke and ash. The heat from the fire was unbearable, and I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me. We ran through the chaos, dodging falling branches and flames at our legs and feet. When we finally reached the rest of the crew, I turned back to look. The creature had stopped at the edge of the fire, watching us from the shadows. It didn't follow me, but its glowing eyes stayed locked on me. I could still smell burnt flesh. It was clinging to the air, and I could feel its anger towards us. I know that sounds crazy, but it's like I was inside its head for a moment. Tom asked if I was good, if I was okay. I turned and nodded only for a split second, and when I looked, the creature was gone. Later that night, after we'd regrouped, I stood there staring up at the burning mountainside. The fire continued to rage in the distance. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Every crack of a branch or gust of wind had me on edge, and the image of the creature burned and angry was haunting me. I felt guilty, even though it was just a natural thing that set this fire ablaze. I kind of pitied that creature, seeing it injured and blistered got to me, honestly. Tom came over and sat down beside me. He'd been through more fires than anyone I knew. He was always calm, always steady. He looked up at the mountain and then back at me. He told me, "Son, don't worry about it." He said he had seen many things out there before. He told me the thing I saw. It was just an animal that wants to be left alone. I'll never forget it. He said if you don't threaten it or challenge it, it won't hurt you. I didn't think he saw the thing. I just looked at him confused. But I also saw wisdom in his eyes and felt the weight of his words. The last thing he told me that night, and he never talked about it again after that. He said if you ever run into another one of those, kid, never look directly into their eyes or point a firearm at them. They don't take kindly to that. And if you do, they will kill you. Trust me, I know from experience. I didn't know what to even say to that, so I just nodded. He knew what it was. He told me it was called a Dogman, though I wasn't sure if I believed him. But one thing was certain. I'd never forget the look in that creature's eyes, and I'd never forget the fear that took over my entire body when it just stood there 10 feet away, watching me as the world burned around us. I still can't forget that image. I know I never will. Tom refused to tell me anything else. He knew exactly what it was. He'd seen it before. I had to do my own research, and I still don't understand the name that people put on these creatures. Dogman. Who came up with that? Because that's not a effing dog. And it didn't look like any man I've ever come across. To me, it looked like your typical movie version of a werewolf. I was shocked when I found out how many people, not only in the United States, but all over the globe, had encountered these creatures. I've been called to help with a lot of fires after this happened, and I've never encountered another Dogman. At one point, I've even considered going out and looking for another one. I just want to see one more time. I can't bring myself to go alone. If I could get at least a couple people that I trusted fully, I would do it. You may think I'm crazy, but if you ever see one, maybe you'll understand. Yes, it's a terrifying beast, sure, but there's also something about it. It feels almost ancient, somewhat biblical in my mind. I don't know, hell, maybe I am a lunatic. Dogman is out there, people, even if you don't believe me. How about the other thousands of people who have similar sightings? Is everyone lying? All it takes out of thousands of accounts for this to be real is one true encounter. And I can promise you now, my story, my encounter, is that one real one. They are out there. Thanks. Jake. You know how GPS can sometimes take you on routes that don't make sense? That's exactly what happened to us, and that's how we ended up in the middle of nowhere outside Taylor, Mississippi, in August of 2022. It was supposed to be a simple drive back home after a visit with some old friends, but instead, we found ourselves lost in the backwoods, far from any familiar road. We'd spent the weekend up in Oxford visiting some old friends from college. It wasn't anything crazy, just a laid-back trip to catch up with folks we hadn't seen in years. My friend and I had both been so caught up with work that we barely got a chance to do things like that anymore. So we figured we'd make the most of it. We spent a couple of days eating, drinking, and laughing about the good old days, taking a little tour of Oxford to see how things had changed since we'd last been there. By Sunday evening, it was time to head home. We left just before sunset. We thought we had plenty of time to make the drive back without any problems. The plan was simple. Take the highway, get home by midnight, and be ready for the work week. But the GPS seemed to have had other plans. As we left Oxford, the GPS rerouted us, sending us off the main road and onto some smaller highways. We didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes it does that to avoid traffic. So we just went along with it. But after a while, the road started to get more narrow, more isolated. Soon we were on a winding country road surrounded by nothing but trees on both sides. The sky was getting darker by the minute, and the uneasy feeling in my gut started to grow. The road was completely empty. No houses, no street lights, no signs of life, just the occasional open field. My friend was dozing off in the passenger seat, so I didn't say anything at first, hoping that maybe the GPS would correct itself. But after about an hour of driving, we were definitely lost. By now, it was completely dark, and we hadn't seen another car in ages. I tried to pull up the map on my phone, but we'd lost cell service miles ago. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no way to tell where we were or how to get back on track. The GPS froze on the screen, stuck on some nameless dirt road with no directions. I woke my friend up and we started trying to figure out what to do. There were no signs, and the dirt road we were on just kept winding deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, and their branches reaching over the road and made it feel like we were in a tunnel. My friend started to get anxious and asking where we were and why the GPS had taken us so far off course. I didn't have any answers, but I could feel that same gnawing sense of dread creeping up my spine. After what felt like hours, we finally saw something. It was a run-down house barely visible in the distance, set back off the road. The place looked abandoned, and the windows were boarded up and weeds were overtaking the yard. I suggested we pull over, take a minute to regroup, and see if we could get a signal or at least figure out where we were. As soon as we stepped out of the car, though, everything felt wrong. The air was heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. There was no wind, no sound, no animals, just silence. It was a kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not alone. It makes you feel like something is watching you. My friend wandered off a bit, trying to hold her phone up for a signal, while I stayed near the car, my eyes locked on the tree line. Without warning, I hear a snap, like a heavy foot crushing a branch. I turned toward the sound. Something was moving in the woods. At first, I couldn't see much, just shadows darting from tree to tree. I started hearing this electrical buzzing or humming sound. It was very loud and unmistakably close. I was confused about what I was hearing or where it could be coming from. It sounded like it was coming from inside the woods. I called out to my friend, telling her I thought we needed to leave. She didn't hesitate. She was hearing it as well. But then the sound just stopped, followed by more silence. We were both inching toward the car while looking all around us, feeling like something was definitely watching us. That is, without a doubt, the most uncomfortable feeling of my lifetime. We both heard more branches being broken, and it sounded like something big was moving in our direction. At the same time, we both saw this thing. It was just a dark shape, a shadow, basically. It slowly walked out from the trees. It was walking on two legs. It had to be no less than 8 or 9 feet tall. It was covered in fur. We both stood there, in shock and silence, watching against our own will, as the creature stepped further into the clearing, revealing its full form. It was unlike anything I've ever seen. It looked like a wolf, but it wasn't just a wolf. Its face was elongated, with a long snout. Its eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight like they were reflecting something. The body was hunched with this wide chest and a tapered waist, and long skinny limbs. It was dark, and I couldn't make out any fine details, but I could see enough to know what I was looking at was not any kind of animal that should be walking around in Mississippi, or anywhere else for that matter. For a moment it just stood there watching us, then, without warning, it dropped down onto all fours and started moving towards us, fast. But it wasn't running in a straight line. It disappeared into the tall weeds, and all we could see was the weeds parting like water as it moved towards us, zigzagging through the field. Complete panic set in. My friend and I both scrambled to the car. But before we could even reach the doors, headlights appeared behind us. An old beat-up truck pulled up and skid to a stop. An elderly man stepped out holding a very large rifle. He didn't say a word at first, he just waved us toward the car with a look on his face that told me everything I needed to know. He knew exactly what was out there. He scanned the area, rifle at the ready, and once we were safely in our car, he told us to follow him. Looking back on it now, we were so dumb. Following a strange old man with a rifle in the middle of nowhere. But that option seemed better than what we were facing before he showed up, so without a second thought, we followed him down the road, not even considering to look back. The drive felt like it lasted forever, the silence between us only broken by the sound of gravel crunching under the tires. Eventually he pulled over on the side of the road, not far from where we'd first seen the creature. The old man got out of his truck, rifle still in hand, and walked over to our car. His face was worn, lined with age, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. His voice was rough. We just nodded. We were too frightened to even speak. He leaned against the window, looking back toward the woods we had just come from. "That thing's been out here for months. It's a Dogman." That word instantly sent chills all over me. I'd heard of a Dogman before. Stories of a wolf-like creature seen in different parts of the country, including here in Mississippi. But I never believed any of that. Not until that moment. The old man went on to explain that he'd been seeing this creature regularly for the past 6 months. It had killed some of his livestock, stalked the outskirts of his farm, and even gotten close to his house a few times. He'd tried everything to get rid of it, traps, alarms, cameras, lights, but nothing worked, and bullets didn't seem to do a thing. "I've shot at it more times than I can count," he said. "Point blank. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't flinch. It just keeps coming." He described how he'd first encountered it late one night out by his cattle. At first he thought it was a wolf or a coyote, but when he saw it standing on 2 legs, he knew it was something else entirely. Since then, the creature has terrorized his farm, always showing up at night, always watching from the tree line. Sometimes it would come close enough that he could see its glowing eyes through his windows. "Folks around here know about it," he said. "They've seen it too. It's been spotted all over Mississippi. Some people say it's been around for years, maybe longer, but no one talks about it. They're too scared, and for good reason." I asked him if there was any way to stop it, but he just shook his head. "You can't kill it," he said. "At least not with anything I've got. I don't know what it is, but it's not an animal. It's something else." We thanked him for his help, and he gave us a word of warning. Don't ever come back out here at night. If you do, it will find you. And if you see it, don't run. It enjoys the chase. We didn't need to be told twice. As we drove away, I couldn't ignore the feeling of how lucky we'd been. Too lucky. That thing, whatever it was, had been watching us, stalking us, and if it hadn't been for the old man, I don't know if we would have made it out of there. I'm almost certain we would not have. Since that night, I've looked up everything I can find about the Dogman. There are stories, sightings, even supposed evidence, but nothing concrete. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever's out there, whatever you guys want to call it, names don't really matter at this point. All that matters is what we all know. It's real. Love and prayers from Mississippi. Anonymous. Hello, everybody. My name is Kyle, and I'm going to share with you my Dogman encounter. It was late summer 2015, probably somewhere around the end of September. Me and my buddy Mark had been talking about getting out to Cherokee National Forest for months. It was the first thing we'd planned together in a long time. But things weren't exactly going smoothly between us. We hadn't hung out as much recently, and I could tell something was off with him. He'd been distant, dodging my calls. But this camping trip seemed like the perfect way to reconnect, figure out what was happening with him. We headed out to a spot near Ocoee Lake. I think that's how you say that, not sure. Not far from Wachisi Mountain, but far enough off any main roads that we knew we'd have the place to ourselves. There's a lot of legal dispersed camping in that area, and we found a good clearing just off an old logging road. The plan was simple. Set up the tent, fish for a little while, then cook up some dinner over the fire. But from the moment we got there, Mark just wasn't himself. It started with little things. He'd kept glancing over his shoulder, his mood shifting between quiet and agitated. I asked him a couple of times if something was bothering him, but he'd just ignore me. I figured maybe he wasn't used to the quiet anymore. Life back in town had a way of doing that, making you uneasy when things got too still. By the time evening rolled around, I could sense it too. The forest just felt different. It's hard to describe without experiencing it yourself. You ever get that feeling when the woods go dead silent all of a sudden? Like everything knows something is about to happen. It was like that, and it wasn't just in my head. The birds had stopped, everything stopped, even the wind. We were sitting by the fire when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but it got stronger. It was a strong smell of sulfur mixed with a weird tinge of some sort of chemical. I asked Mark if he smelled it too, and he just nodded. Neither of us said anything for a few minutes. We just sat there, listening. About 10 minutes passed without a sound, then we heard something. Not far off in the woods, it was a snap, a crack like someone heavy stepping on a limb. But it wasn't just one sound. It was followed by the sound of a large pack of coyotes going insane. They were pretty close to us, maybe a few hundred yards. It was loud. It sounded like they started spreading out and circling our campsite. And slowly, they were closing in on us. I'd never been in a situation like this, so I just grabbed my gun, a .45, and Mark had a machete. We both found a couple trees that we could climb and decided it would be safer if we got off the ground and just let them pass through. We were both in a tree, maybe 20 feet up, and were about 20 yards apart. I could still hear them getting louder, getting closer. It wasn't dark yet, but it was nearly there. It sounded like they were right on top of us, but I never saw anything. Out of nowhere, the woods is filled with the loudest, deepest, most insane howl I have ever heard in my entire life. I felt the tree I was in vibrating. It lasted well over 10 seconds, and as soon as it stopped, silence again. Not a single sound. The coyotes had went quiet. It was so quiet my hearing was muffled. I had no idea what had made the howl and had no idea what we should do. It sounded like a wolf, but whatever had lungs big enough to produce that howl was a lot bigger than a wolf. After staying in the trees until well after dark, we hadn't heard anything else, so we decided to climb down and get everything packed up and leave. Nothing else happened as we got camp packed away. We started making our way slowly back toward the truck. Luckily, we both did have really good flashlights, so we could light the woods up pretty bright. Mark was being even more weird now. He was acting confused. He wasn't acting confused or puzzled by our situation. We were maybe halfway out when we swept our lights across the trees and across the trail. That's when we saw a deer, or what was left of one. It was right in the middle of the trail, and it was torn up, shredded like something had ripped it apart. It was fresh, too. The blood was still wet on the leaves, and it wasn't there when we walked in earlier. That's when Mark completely lost it. He turned to face me, and his face was completely unhinged, and he said, "We have to get out of here now." I'd never seen him like that. He was always the calm one, always the one with a plan. But there was no reasoning with him. He was scared out of his mind, and for a second, I thought maybe he'd lost it. I was terrified as well, but I was somehow keeping it together. Just as I was trying my best to talk him back down a bit, we heard something start growling off to our right. And whatever it was fairly close. We both turned around, pointing our flashlights in the direction, but there wasn't anything there. Then the growl came again, but it was behind us. At the time, I never dreamed it would be one animal. Nothing is that fast and that quiet. I just thought there were a few coyotes around us, but unfortunately, that would not be the case. Before we had an opportunity to think or react, something crashed through the trees, barreling straight at us. All I saw was this blur of black fur and a set of yellow eyes. It was huge, bigger than any bear that I'd seen, and it moved fast, way too fast. We both turned and ran straight toward the truck, but Mark didn't make it very far. I heard him yell out in pain, and when I turned around, he was on the ground. Something had knocked him down. My mind was screaming at me to do something, to help him, but my body wouldn't move. That thing, whatever it was standing over him. It was on two legs and hunched over, no more than 6 or 7 feet away from him. The smell coming off of it was sickening. It was that sulfur smell from earlier. This thing looked like a wolf, but its eyes were glowing in the light from my flashlight, yellow, and seemed to be very pissed off. I just reacted in a split second and raised my pistol and squeezed off a round right at this thing, center mass. It turned its head toward me, cocked it to the side, and exhaled, making a blowing sound. I was about to squeeze another one off, but instead of coming after me, it just let out a snarl and took off back into the woods. Mark was hurt, but he was alive. His shirt was shredded, and there were deep gashes across his back and shoulders, like he'd been clawed. We didn't waste any time. I dropped everything except the flashlight and my gun. I helped him up, and we kept punching down the path, praying to make it to the truck. I'm pretty sure Mark was in shock, and I was trying to come to terms with what the hell just happened. I don't know what we saw, but Part of me still wants to believe it was a bear. Hell, that's the government's cover story with these things. Sorry, but bears don't stand on two legs like that. And they sure as hell don't disappear into the woods like ghosts. We heard it circling us the entire way out, occasionally growling, and a few times it bluff charged us, and I would pop off a shot and send it running back into the woods. Without that gun, we would have been goners, for sure. People, carry protection, especially in the woods. We finally got to the truck, and Mark had lost a ton of blood. He was pale and gashed up pretty good. I took him to the ER and told them we had been attacked while camping, but we didn't actually see what did it. It was too dark. Of course, and you probably guessed it, they blamed it on a bear. We didn't argue to avoid any more questions or possibly dealing with some shadow agency. Oh yeah, I've heard the stories about these people that show up after these encounters. That's not a group of individuals that I'm interested in meeting anytime soon. So we never reported exactly what we saw. What would we even say? It was a creature that's called Dogman that the government knows about. Please don't call them. Yeah, how about no to all of that? We just don't talk about it at all, and I haven't been back to that part of the woods since, and neither has Mark. Whatever we saw out there, it wasn't a bear. I think I know exactly what it was, and I'm pretty sure about that. Be careful, folks. Get a gun. Learn how to use it safely. These things are out there, and they are everywhere. They say the cities are dangerous nowadays, which they are, but in my opinion the woods are way worse. Be safe, never go out alone, and follow your instincts. Have a blessed day. Kyle. Just refer to me as Papa Juliet. I had a Dogman encounter while doing training, war games exercise in the military. Please leave my information out, even though I was never at any time ordered not to divulge information about the event, nor was I ever even asked by commanding personnel not to discuss what transpired one cold night in northwestern United States. So with that said, I am not under possible persecution. However, I learned enough in the military to know you can avoid a lot of minefields by keeping your mouth shut. I am an ex-Air Force pararescue operator, or PJ for short. It's a very specialized career field in the military, and is one of the few of the Air Force's Special Forces units. After having several combat tours in the Middle East and North Africa, one area the U.S. military learned from these wars which we needed to improve upon was working better as one unit, but from different branches. Simply meaning if I was assigned to assist a Navy SEAL team with an immediate mission, we should be familiar with working together, as the way the Air Force does something and the way the Navy does things could cause problems. And you know what happens when problems arise in a combat situation? Exactly. People die when they shouldn't. So I was sent to northwestern U.S. to Redacted, then funneled down to Redacted training facility, who was assigned the task of training Special Forces operators in cold weather mountain warfare. I can't remember the acronym used, but I'm 100% sure one was used, as the military loves acronyms. The first 4 days were all classroom, and then we boarded a couple of CH-47 Chinook helicopters, the double rotor guys, that took one team to the base of Mount Hood, and the other team, playing the bad guys, which I was tasked with, about 20 miles away from the base of Mount Hood, in the direction of Mount St. Helens. This is a heavily wooded area that has a lot of hikers and campers, but Being the middle of winter and the U.S. Forest Service closing some areas of the park for our training, run-ins with civilians were highly unlikely. Basically, I was assigned to a group of 2 4-man fire teams, tasked with locating and disrupting and terminating enemy forces while keeping a level of invisibility, using the skills of which every participating military branch special force member there were experts at. The first night we quietly advanced into a position which we knew the good guys must pass through before arriving at their objective. We knew we had about 4 hours of downtime before they were to arrive at this location, so we enjoyed jokes or discussion about girls or war stories to pass the time until we were to light up the cold, dark pre-dawn with concussion explosions and automatic weapons fire. Blanks, of course. We had taken the highest level ground with firing lanes which would pin the good guys down in between 2 sheer rock walls on either side. The only thing really above us was a rock ledge that was about 10 meters high. There was a small cave opening and jagged rocks on either side that would be too difficult of obstacles to quietly sneak up on our position from behind. When we calculated contact might be made within an hour, we all went silent. This was around 2:30 a.m. I remember it was absolutely freezing, easily right around 0 degrees and windy at times. Behind us we had heard rocks sliding, which at first we assumed it was just gravity doing its thing. We were all basically within eyesight to easily give hand signals, although we had earpiece Motorola units that we could use sparingly until contact, or if someone was injured we could stop the exercise by going to a different channel and contacting the instructors. A voice came over my earpiece saying there is someone walking around above our position. I was thinking that's impossible. They literally would have had to pass us to circle behind us. There's no way. Now all 8 of us are paying close attention to any movement behind us. I remember in training at some point in my career being told in a wooded environment, rely upon your hearing sometimes more than your sight to alert you of something approaching. The only thing that will freeze after stepping on a branch that snaps is a human. The wind had died down to where we all heard footsteps, but only lightly. 1 here, 2 there. It could be anything. Until we heard obvious bipedal footsteps and they stepped on a branch and pop, then nothing. We knew now that at least 1 human, but probably more, were behind us. How was this possible? Could it be civilians? Not likely. Instructors? Possibly. I sent 2 younger SEALs from Team 2 out of Virginia to quietly swing around the cliff above us and come in on our guest's flank. Myself and a fellow Air Force PJ, I'll just call Zulu, mirrored the 2 SEALs' movements just on the opposite side of the cliff. Taking several minutes to scale the rocky face and ensuring silence so we could scare and shock the Army instructors that thought they could outsmart the Air Force and Navy guys. I just knew we were the ones about to get the last laugh by outsmarting the teachers. Just as I was about to poke my head up on the ledge and low crawling on my stomach, we all hear the first SEAL's voice crack in our ears saying, "What the F is that?" I immediately raise my head above the lip of the ledge. That's when I lock eyes with the biggest, scariest nightmare of a wolf on all 4s. Literally 8 to 9 meters from my face. I can see under this freak I'm looking at, because it's so unbelievably huge that just behind it is another monster of a wolf the same size staring at what I can only assume are the 2 SEALs. Then a growl that reminds me of something that you were only going to hear out of movies like Jurassic Park, but I can feel it in my chest. This creature's eyes snapped down and to the left, locking on my M4. Its massive yellow eyes dart back and forth from my eyes to my weapon. I'm noticing that this creature's eyes seem to show recognition at seeing my M4, but how is that possible? But it's obvious it seems to know what it is. However, it probably doesn't realize it's got a 30-round magazine loaded with effing blanks. Then I hear these popping sounds, like knuckles, only 1,000 times louder. I notice the head of the monster, feet from my face, begin doing the unthinkable. It begins to rise and rise and rise, not once letting its eyes leave mine. I know it's seeing my expression on my face, that I was absolutely petrified. 3 combat tours in the Middle East, one time spending 3 nights from hell in redacted, that I didn't think I was going to survive. Being shot at constantly, but I've never felt fear like this. Now this monster is standing at its full height, easily 8.5 to 9 feet tall. I'm on my stomach, arching my back to look up at this thing. That's when I hear the sound of an M4 being charged, putting a round in the chamber. It's a metal-to-metal sound I know all too well. That's when I remember each man has 1 magazine with 30 live 5.56 NATO rounds, but used only for emergency situations. We had been told that they have never encountered a situation that anyone needed to use live fire before, but I'm pretty sure they were never laying on their little bellies with 9-foot-tall werewolves standing over them either. Oh, no, I'm sure not. Also, in the same instance, I heard the round being chambered. I don't think shooting one of these things is going to be a good idea at all. I noticed this monster standing basically on top of me. It's looking behind me with a look of rage that I've never seen, even in the scariest of Hollywood movies or in war. I think training kicked in and I realized I've already put a real 30-round magazine in my M4 and chambered a round. My right thumb clicking the safety off and continuing the lever around, not stopping until my weapon is now in full auto. Never in combat should you really use full auto because it's a waste of rounds. However, again, the 9-foot werewolves weren't in the mix either, so effing auto it was. Taking a prone position, I fire, aiming center mass, taking my weapon from my 12 o'clock ready position and slightly raising to take aim from center mass to a headshot. But before I could raise my weapon 6 inches, both of these creatures launched into the air. When I say launched, it reminded me of Superman taking off. They were just gone. The one in front of me jumped directly over my head and back. The other one jumped to a tree, then I have no idea. Nothing can prepare you for how fast these creatures move. It's almost like they can disappear. The one in front of me was every bit of 600 pounds. I am 100% positive 3 to 4 rounds hit this creature, but it was like they just passed through without damage. I've seen people shot with 1 round from much farther away, and the damage inflicted is grave. I remember saying into the radio, "Go, go, go. We have to get to safe distance immediately." Of course, our radios are jumbled from chatter from instructors and other troops hearing the automatic gunfire calling alarm red, simply meaning exercise terminated. Also, the sound between a blank being fired and a real 5.56 being fired in full automatic is obviously a different sound. Questions were coming over the radio faster than the rounds out of our M4s, but all 8 of us that were up there with those monsters were not focused on answering the radio with anything except real-world situation, will advise shortly. We are en route to your location. Of course, not knowing exactly where that was, we knew it was in a different direction of those creatures. We now have our tactical flashlights lighting up the woods in front of us. Each man has by now inserted a real 5.56 magazine with rounds chambered and safeties off. We are running, and with our gear clanking, we can hear what sounds like bulldozers flanking both sides of us. About a half a mile down and to our right, a round out of a grenade launcher called a starlight parachute is fired, illuminating the forest into immediate daylight. These rounds are exactly what they sound like, being a burning white phosphorus flare falling slowly under a tiny parachute. They produce a huge parameter. We then saw both creatures on both sides running while keeping their eyes on us. Also, from behind us, it sounds like they brought friends. Effing great. I hear another pop, and another starlight cluster is fired and illuminates directly above us. I can now see other men rendezvousing with our position. The sudden brightness right on top of us must have caused the creatures to redirect off into the woods. We were met by an Army First Sergeant instructor and an Army Major and First Lieutenant. We started giving accounts of everything that transpired. Hearing it come out of our mouths sounded absolutely insane, yet I could easily tell they already knew about these things. Immediately we were taken to a pickup location, and at first light we were on helicopters back to redacted northwestern U.S. We were told to remain in our quarters, only to leave for chow and back to our assigned rooms with no mingling outside our rooms. I was in a room with 2 single beds. My roommate was one of the SEALs that was directly across from me. We compared stories, with only a couple of differences. He said the creature on his side had urinated right next to him, and the SEAL behind him. I realized he had only come back to our room after dinner. He said they had to shower for 45 minutes to get the smell off from being splattered on. He also said the one by him was squeezing its hands and relaxing them and turning its head from side to side, like attack was imminent. That's why he was the first to change his magazine to real rounds. The training was supposed to go for another week, but early the following morning we were sent back to our respective locations. I'm surprised that we weren't told to not talk about what happened, but they probably thought, what are these guys going to say? We saw a pack of real breathing werewolves? Yeah, that's what they can say. But that's exactly what happened. So the military definitely knows about these things. The spooks that people sometimes report being visited by after going too public with their encounters describe ex-military special ops guys, now contractors. They are excellent at intimidating you, enough to quiet you. Then, when you have the really stubborn people that don't do well with intimidation, they seem to always have car crashes or heart attacks at 30 years old. These guys usually aren't connected to the government anymore, so they aren't held accountable and basically have total immunity. Of course, being paid by some company like Blackwater or the like, for me, I can take a hint. Peace. My encounter takes place in September 2007 in Lyons, Wisconsin. I won't use real names in this, don't even ask. It's not gonna happen. Alrighty. It happened to me and my best friend at the time, and still today. Let's call him Jake. Back when Jake and I were 12, we thought we knew every nook and cranny of Lyons. It was a small town, mostly quiet neighborhoods surrounded by stretches of woods and farms. Our world was school, baseball cards, and riding our bikes until the streetlights came on. At that age, we had a routine, and anything outside of it felt exciting, sometimes mysterious. There was a boy in the neighborhood named David who went to our school. David was a little different. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it was usually about animals. Most kids didn't pay him much attention, but Jake and I knew him well enough to say hello when we saw him. David didn't have any friends, and there was a certain sadness about him that made me feel sorry for him. One afternoon in early September, Jake and I were riding our bikes down his street, just killing time after school, when David called out to us from his front yard. He was waving us over with this huge grin on his face like he had something really important to show us. I glanced at Jake and he had the same look of what the hell on his face. But then we both just pedaled over to the yard. David was practically bouncing, he was so excited. He said he wanted to introduce us to his dog, Wolfie. I looked around the yard, confused because I'd never seen him with a dog before. Jake looked confused as well. But David kept going on and on about his dog, so we went along with it. We followed him around the side of the house and into the backyard. He led us down this narrow trail that cut through a small patch of woods behind his house. Jake and I just looked at each other, both of us getting a bit nervous. It was the kind of look you give when you know you're doing something that might not be the best of ideas. But David was so happy and excited that neither of us wanted to hurt his feelings. After about 10 minutes of walking, we reached a small clearing littered with what looked like bones and old scraps of food. David pointed to the ground, telling us that this was where he fed Wolfie. My stomach twisted in knots at the sight of all the bones. They were picked clean and scattered all around. I started feeling very uneasy, but David didn't seem to notice. He cupped his hands around his mouth and started calling out, "Here, Wolfie, I've got new friends for you to meet." We stood there, dead silent, as the forest around us came alive with movement. Branches cracked and we could hear leaves crunching, and it felt like something was circling us in the trees. David smiled, saying that Wolfie was just shy around strangers. He mentioned how he'd tried to show his parents, but they didn't believe him. That made me feel even more uneasy. Something about this didn't feel like a simple pet meet and greet. Then I saw something moving. At first, it looked like a big shadow moving fast through the trees. The shape was much too large to be that of a dog. It stepped into the clearing and I nearly soiled myself. Standing there on two legs was a creature that had to be at least 9 feet tall. It was covered in coal-black fur that looked patchy with bald spots where scars crossed the skin. Its body was muscular, like a bodybuilder's, and its head was massive, way too big for its body. It had these glowing amber eyes that seemed to not belong to a natural animal. It had ears like a wolf or German shepherd, long and pointed. And it had a short, thick muzzle that somehow looked very close to a human. Jake and I were frozen to stone. I felt like I was made out of concrete. I couldn't move. David, on the other hand, just kept talking to it, calling it Wolfie, like it was his pet. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a roll of summer sausage, tossing it on the ground in front of the creature. The creature took a step forward, and its jerky, unnatural movements making me clench my eyes shut and pray that I was about to wake up from a nightmare. It was staring at David, then back at us, back and forth, like it was nervous about us being there. Its hands, they looked almost human, just much larger, with fingers, long, nasty-looking fingers. It picked up the sausage with a sort of chilling ease, like it had been fed like this many times before, the whole time keeping its eyes locked on us. David turned to us and asked if we wanted to pet it, like this thing was some kind of friendly dog. Jake and I slowly started stepping back, and that's when I accidentally stepped on a stick. The loud crack seemed to make it nervous or even angry. In an instant, this creature's head whipped around and locked eyes on us completely. It lowered its body, bending its knees in a way that looked like it was ready to jump. A growl broke the silence, and I knew we had to get out of there. We both turned at the same time and hauled ass, ignoring David screaming behind us. He was yelling for us to come back, saying that Wolfie wouldn't hurt us, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. Behind us, I could hear the creature crashing through the trees. Its breathing was getting closer. Branches snapped, and it sounded like it was tearing small trees down just to get to us. We didn't stop until we burst out of the woods back into the safety of David's yard. The sounds of the crashing stopped as soon as we left the trees, but I didn't look back to see. We jumped onto our bikes, and I remember my hands shaking. Without a word, we were gone, pedaling faster than we ever had in our lives. Once we were a safe distance away, we stopped to catch our breath. We didn't talk much, we just shared a few stunned looks as we tried to figure out what the hell had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was a werewolf, but those things only existed in stories and movies. Maybe he tricked us somehow, and it was a costume. But it was just too big, and it looked too real. We were just kids, so we didn't know what to think or believe. That evening we decided we would, and we told our parents everything. They were furious that we'd followed someone into the woods without telling anyone and warned us to never do it again. They figured David must have had a large pet dog, and they forbid us from going anywhere near his house again. Over the next few weeks, we noticed that David had stopped coming to school. Curious and also a little worried, we started asking around, but no one seemed to know much. Eventually, we heard that David and his family had moved to a different town a few hours away. I felt a strange mix of relief and worry. Relief that he was away from whatever was in those woods, but worry that maybe he'd taken it with him. Years passed and Jake and I drifted apart. By the time we were in high school, we hardly talked at all, though we still shared that silent understanding of what we'd been through. It wasn't until I was 19, working a summer job at a camp in Michigan, that I heard the word Dogman for the first time. A camp counselor was telling stories around the fire one night, and he mentioned a creature that people claimed to have seen in the woods. A creature with a wolf's head that stood on two legs covered in fur, with glowing amber eyes. It felt like I was being hit with a brick. I stayed up late that night reading everything I could find about Dogman sightings, and I came across stories from Wisconsin, including some near Bray Road, which I'm sure you are familiar with. The descriptions matched exactly what we'd seen. The more I read, the more it felt like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. A few years later, Jake and I reconnected at a high school reunion. After some awkward small talk, we finally brought up that day in the woods. We both remembered it clearly, every little detail. He told me about the nightmares he used to have, and I admitted that I'd had them as well. Talking about it felt like finally letting go of a weight we'd both been carrying. We regained our friendship and talk every day now. I haven't seen anything like it since, but sometimes when I'm walking my dog at night, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see Wolfie watching me from the trees. This world is full of mysteries, and some of them I suspect may never be fully solved or explained. But I'll never forget that September day in Lyons, when we came face to face with something straight out of hell. Anonymous.
I've lived here all my life. Wife, kids, 9 to 5. You know how all that goes. My upbringing was probably a bit strange to some folks. My dad was an alcoholic, so I spent most of my childhood and teen years with my grandpa. He was a hard man, but had a kind heart. He taught me everything I know about the outdoors, hunting, fishing, tending the fields, and livestock. He delivered the local mail for decades, then retired and went completely off-grid. If he couldn't grow it, make it, build it, or shoot it, he didn't need nor want it. This encounter, or whatever you would call it, took place in 1998. I was 12 years old at the time. Every Saturday morning, like clockwork, we would have breakfast, get our guns and our boots, and head out on our morning hike. That's what he called it. He always wore denim overalls, carried a snub-nosed .38 and a walking stick. He used the pistol for snakes and smaller critters. He would always let me bring his 20-gauge shotgun in case we saw a squirrel or a rabbit. That's how we got our dinner. There were no stores for 30 miles or so. He was deep in the mountains. Anyway, that morning seemed normal, like many mornings before, but you will soon find out. It was anything but normal. That day, everything changed for me. I was never the same after what happened. I became a man that day. You know, most times our questions have answers, but sometimes, in that rare occasion, you really don't want the answers, and maybe you shouldn't. Maybe some things are better just left alone. You know what I mean? I apologize. I'm a bit nervous. I've never told this story to anyone before. We always walked for miles on these hikes, looking for wild edibles, such as mushrooms and poke salad. This particular day, we headed for a ridgetop way off in the distance. We hiked for hours. It had to be around noon by the time we got there. We sat for a few hours talking, eating beanie weenies, and squirrel hunting. Around 2 or 3 in the evening, he told me it was time to head back so we could make it home before it got dark. It gets dark quick on the backsides of these mountains. When I say dark, it's a different dark. I'm talking pitch black, ace of spades dark. You get caught out here at night with no torch or flashlight, the only option you got is sleep with your back against a tree, or wait up until sunrise, because you are not getting out of these woods at night. We slowly made our way down the mountainside. I was getting pretty tired about halfway down. It must have been around 5 p.m. as we neared the base of the hill because it was already getting dark. This is where things get a little crazy. He suddenly stopped, putting his hand up, signaling me to stop as well. I thought we were about to shoot an animal and have meat for dinner. I was wrong. He turned to me with a look on his face I'd never seen before. It was fear. I'd never seen him be afraid of anything. He whispered, "Do you hear that, boy?" I said, "No, I don't hear anything." He said, "Yeah, that's my point." He stood in silence for a good 3 to 5 minutes, then said, "We have to go, right now." At this point, I'm getting scared. Something has this man rattled, and whatever had him scared terrified me. We get maybe 100 yards from the base of the mountain, at which point we will hit a small dirt path that we follow for a mile or so, then onto a gravel road for a ways. That gravel road will lead us back home. I start to feel very uneasy. You know, sometimes you feel like something is right behind you, the hairs on the nape of your neck stand, and you turn around quick, just to find nothing there. Yeah, that's the feeling. That's what I was getting. At one point, I thought I heard something following us, but I saw nothing every time I turned to look behind me. Well, except for the last time I turned around. I saw a squirrel running up a tree, so I watched it climbing up. That's when everything went to hell. This tree was huge, and about halfway up, I saw something. I had just enough light to make out some details. I saw a clawed, 5-fingered hand reaching around the tree, which led me to see what was peeking around the tree at us. I saw a huge, jet-black wolf head. I couldn't see the body because it was behind the tree, but judging by the size of this thing's head, it had to be massive. The thing that scared me the most were the eyes. Those eyes have haunted me my entire life. They seemed almost self-illuminating. They were the deepest blue color I have ever seen before. And son, make no mistake, this thing was not friendly. Its eyes were full of malice, anger, hatred, and rage. I immediately urinated on myself. No control whatsoever. It just stared at me. I don't know how long, but I had a moment of fight or flight kick in, so I made a split-second decision to pull my shotgun up and take aim at this thing. Just as I pulled the trigger, my grandpa grabbed the shotgun and pointed it to the treetops. Boom! Shooting straight up into the air. He yelled at me. We go now. No matter what you hear, son, look forward. Do not look at it, especially in the eyes. Now move. I'm right behind you. We're moving fast, and I can hear this thing jumping from tree to tree. It's using the trees to chase us. What kind of animal can do that? We don't have gorillas in Kentucky. I don't know if it grew tired of the cat and mouse game we were playing, but it jumped down out of the trees. The drop had to be 25 or 30 feet. When it hit the ground, it was on all fours, but it wasn't running normal. It's hard to explain. It reminded me of a spider almost. It was faster than anything should be. It almost seemed like I was stuck in a nightmare. It toyed with us all the way down the path, growling, snorting, howling. The growl stood out to me as well. You know the bubble wrap stuff they put in packages? Well, it sounded like a lion growling, but add the bubble wrap popping sounds to the growl. It's hard to explain, really. We finally busted out of the undergrowth from the path to the gravel road. It's more open now, and we have some moonlight to help us see a bit. This is when I saw the beast in its entirety. I turned to see if Grandpa was still behind me. He was, but behind him, standing on two legs in the middle of the road, with devilish blue eyes, was this, what I would only call a werewolf. It had to be 6.5 to 7 feet tall, jet black fur with a massive head and pointy ears. Its hands were also abnormally large. It was just wrong. It didn't look real. It had a huge chest that tapered to a very slim waist. Its arms, yeah, it had arms, were long and skinny, hands hanging almost to its knees. This thing looked like an athletic man covered in black hair with 10-inch fingers and a giant wolf head. I don't know if it had a tail. I never saw it if it did. I thought we were about to die when all of a sudden we hear a far-off distant howl that rattled every bone in my body. As the howl drew our attention away from the beast for just a second or two, I heard a loud crash in the underbrush, and I heard the trees cracking and popping under extreme load. This thing was going back the way we came. It was moving away, back up the mountainside. I didn't have time to catch my breath. I was soaked in my own urine and shaking violently. My grandpa woke me from my state of shock by grabbing me and saying, "Move, now!" We only had a mile or so, and we would be home. That was the longest mile of my life. It seemed like an eternity, but we finally made it home. We never took hikes again after that day. I never wanted to anyway. My grandpa died 3 years after this happened. He refused to talk about it. I tried bringing it up several times. All he ever said was, "Not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and not all secrets are meant to be told. Some things in life just can't be explained. Follow the Lord. He will never leave you, son. Remember that." He never acknowledged my questions regarding this again after that. Nowadays, I stay away from the mountains because I know what's out there. I saw it. It was a werewolf. No other way to describe it. They are real. And if you decide to go into the woods of southeastern Kentucky, go with faith in the good Lord above, 'cause a gun won't save you from what I saw in 1998. The only thing that can cleanse the dark is light, son. And that thing That thing was born of pure darkness. Take care and watch over your loved ones. I hope this can help someone in some way. Thanks for listening. Godspeed.
Hello. Just call me D. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been nearly 20 years ago. I was just a teenager back then, living in a small town in rural Ohio. We were surrounded by dense woods, the kind that always seemed to hold secrets, and it wasn't uncommon to hear strange noises at night, rustling in the trees, distant howls, but nothing that ever raised any real alarm. Not until that night. It was late October, a few days before Halloween, and I was out with a couple of my friends. We decided to take a walk through the woods, something we did quite often, but that night just felt different. The air was colder than usual, and a thick fog had rolled in, making everything eerily quiet. Even the crickets and the owls had grown silent. We had a path we usually stuck to, but one of my friends, M, suggested we take a different path, a shortcut, he claimed, that would get us back to town faster. I was hesitant, but he insisted. And the others were eager for the adventure, so I went along with it. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the fog grew thicker. It wasn't long before we realized we were lost. The trees all looked the same, and the path we thought we were following had vanished. That's when we heard it, a low guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. It was close, way too close, and none of us could tell which direction it was coming from. We huddled together, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. That's when I saw them. Two amber-colored eyes, almost glowing, staring at us from the darkness. They were way too high off the ground to belong to any ordinary animal. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run. But I was frozen in place, unable to look away from those eyes. Then it stepped into the clearing and into view. I swear it was at least 7 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was elongated, like a wolf, but with terrifying intelligence behind its eyes. It had long claws that I could see in the moonlight, and its breath was visible in the cold night air. I'd never seen anything like it ever before, nor since. One of my friends, T, tried to run, but the creature let out a howl that shook the ground and nearly burst my eardrums. It was the most primal sound I've ever heard in my life. The beast moved so fast, faster than anything that size should be able to. It lunged at T and knocked him down on the ground. The rest of us just stood there, literally paralyzed with fear. I thought for sure we were all going to die. But then something strange happened. This werewolf or dogman, whatever it was, it paused. It looked at each of us as if it was deciding something. Then, with another low growl, it turned and disappeared back into the woods as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't waste any time. We helped T back to his feet. Thankfully, he was just shaken up and in shock. We ran stumbling through the trees and underbrush until we finally found the edge of the woods. We never spoke about what we saw that night. We didn't need to. We all knew what we saw, even if no one else ever believes us. To this day, I can't walk through the woods at night without feeling like something is watching me. The memory of those eyes, that howl, I still have nightmares. I don't know why it let us go, but I am grateful every single day that it did. I've spent years trying to understand what we saw out there, but the truth is, I've come to the conclusion that some things are beyond explanation or our understanding. That's my encounter. I tried to include everything I could remember. I appreciate you wanting to share it. Thank you, and God bless you all. Now on to our second encounter. Did you make sure your windows are locked? Or did you just check the doors? Might want to double check just to make sure. Hey, Real Adventures. After thinking about what happened to me, it all came flooding back. I hadn't thought about that night in years. It was something I had tried to bury deep down, convincing myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, after too many late nights and ghost stories. But the truth is, what I experienced wasn't something that you could easily forget. I'm not giving my name. I hope that's all right. It was the summer after I graduated from high school. I had a part-time job working as a night guard at an old run-down factory on the outskirts of town. The place was mostly abandoned, but the owners kept it on standby for storage and occasionally to process some small orders. My job was simple: walk the perimeter, check the locks, and make sure no one broke in. Easy money, or so I thought. One night I showed up for my shift, and everything seemed normal. The air was humid, and a thunderstorm was brewing, with the distant thunder rumbling through the hillside. I had just finished my rounds when I heard a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the usual creaks and groans of the old building settling. It was a soft scratching noise, like something sharp was being dragged along the metal walls. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, or a stray cat, maybe. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the source of the noise, which seemed to be coming from the back of the factory, near the loading docks. As I got closer, the scratching stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I swept the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing. No signs of anyone or anything. I was about to turn back when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, something dark and very fast. I whipped the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it, crouched low to the ground, just outside the range of the beam. It was huge, at least the size of a bear, but there was something distinctly unnatural about its shape. It was hunched over, its back was arched in a way that made my skin crawl. But it was the eyes that froze me in place. Yellow, glowing eyes that stared right through me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as this creature slowly rose to its full height, towering over me, and I'm 6'2". It had the body of a man, but covered in matted fur, and its face was a twisted blend of human and wolf. Its snout was filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. I've never seen anything so terrifying in my life. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a silent standoff. I could hear its raspy, heavy breathing. I could even smell wet dirt and rot on its fur. Then, with a low growl that seemed to shake the very air around us, it took a step forward. That finally snapped me out of my daze. I bolted, running faster than I ever thought possible. Adrenaline will turn you into almost superhuman. I didn't stop until I was back in the main building, slamming the door behind me and frantically locking it. My heart was beating out of my chest. My mind was racing to try and figure out what I just saw. But I forced myself to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it was just passing through and I just happened to cross its path. But then, destroying all my rational thinking, I heard it again. The scratching sounds, but this time it was on the metal door. The noises were slow. They were deliberate, like this thing was just toying with me. I backed away, searching for something, anything to defend myself with. My eyes landed on an old rusty pipe lying in the corner. I grabbed it, holding it tight as the scratching turned into pounding. The door was beginning to buckle under the pressure. I knew I could not stay there. It was eventually going to get in, so I made a break for it, rushing out the opposite side of the building and into the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, lightning flashing all around me, but I didn't care. I would take my chances out here. I just ran, not looking back until I reached my car. I sat there soaked and shaking, watching the factory through the windshield. The noises and pounding had stopped, and the building was silent once again. I could still feel that thing out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting. I quit my job the next day. I didn't tell anyone what I saw, and honestly, who's going to believe me? Hell, I wouldn't. But I know what I saw. I saw it very clearly. I know what's out there, and every time a storm rolls in, I can't help but to think about that night, wondering if it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for the next unlucky fool who stumbles into its path. People need to be aware that these things are out there. I never even thought of things like this before this happened, much less believing in them. Please be safe while near the woods. This thing just came out of nowhere. I hope this is long enough for your podcast or whatever. That's it. That's what happened. I appreciate you believing me. Most people don't. Thanks.